All right, so, yeah.
Okay, great. So welcome, everyone. My name is Laura Corolano. I'm the interim faculty director for the Center for Design. I'm a professor in the Art and Design department and also in communication studies. I'm delighted to welcome you all here for the first conversation of the semester. We have 4 events lined up. Over the years, we've done a number of different events on different topics. So I encourage you to get on our newsletter, make sure that you know what's coming up and joining us, but either in person, which is great, or online for our upcoming series this academic year. So today I'm happy to welcome Nathan Felde and a number of guest panelists, which I will let Nathan introduce. Thank you so much for kicking us off with the perspectives on design and money.
So I want to welcome our guests who are one in person, Dulmini Perera, and we have Julier there, and Özlem Er also in the panel up there on the right. So coming from it, so we're kind of triangulating the economy from and outside of the mess in the US. We're going to try to move out into a different territory. So we're triangulating a little bit between, let's say, a perspective from Finland and Helsinki and Istanbul and Limerick and even Weimar to some extent. So a little bit of Germany, Ireland, Finland as a set of perspectives and points of view, and each of them unique in terms of what we're addressing today. Primarily because this topic of design and money, one, it's very fraught. It's a taboo subject in design, certainly. I've been telling many stories about that from empirical experience of being a designer for many years. But it's also one which hasn't been interrogated enough in the course of the practice, and maybe not theoretically as well. So I was very, very excited to be able to have this particular set of people address that from these different points of view. The loose structure of this sequence of events is to think kind of an international scope. And Guy brings that out with his Economies of Design book, which I have a copy with. I was going to ask him to sign it, but he's not in the room. Next time, anyway. And then Özlem is going to address it kind of more from a national perspective. So we have the international, and then we go to the national, and Dulmini is I would call local global and sort of universal local, but kind of a local community-based model around value production and that. When we first talked about having this event and how many people we could bring and where we could fly them from, whatever, the answer was we have no money. And I thought it was how ironic. We're talking about design and money, and there is none. Okay, and then shortly after that, this huge attack on the fiscal foundations of academia has taken place, destroying research funding, destroying enrollments, destroying visas for students, and so forth and so on. There's this tremendous cataclysm happening within academia. So again, it's kind of timely to talk about design and money, in particular because we have a big design curriculum here that's very broad and very has a lot of variety in it as well. So so the other way you could put that, so another title for this could be one that comes from this book by Alex Head called Here Comes Trouble. So not to trouble the waters too much, but there's a fantastic book in here, reflections of Alex Head on an experiment in Berlin, of a creative community trying to figure out how to create a time bank, a different kind of exchange of people's time and interest and value. So I highly recommend this book. It has, Nick Huda has a blog on it that's also brilliant and very timely and topical. So the origin of this is from 20 years ago when Peter Koenig, who wrote the book 30 Lies About Money, a lovely book I can recommend as well. I met him in Switzerland, and the book came to my attention through that. And then he and I put together a little conference, not much, maybe about this size, in Montreal 20 years ago, called Design and Money. Out of that came some interesting discussions, one of which was around sociocracy as a way of governance that takes the ego out of leadership, so to speak, and other aspects of that. And if we think further back in time, the relationship between design and money, we have our own Bostonian, W.A. Dwiggins, who wrote this essay on towards a reform of the paper currency, particularly in point of its design. So this reaches back in time to when people were considering design at the sort of discrete level in terms of designing currency. But of course, we know currency is a kind of belief system anyway. You have to believe in it for it to actually work and function. So the thing that's shifted from a design point of view is more and more attention to this relationship between form and belief and form and behavior as opposed to form and function, which has held reign for 100 years as to what we are focused on in the world. So with the global economy also in the kind of artificial and arbitrary chaos or turmoil, one of the questions that comes along with that environment, that context, is this question of, well, what happens to the practice of design going forward? What fuels it? What funds it? What goes into and goes out of the system? And Guy will talk about some of those flows in the history presentation as well. In older times, some of which I participated in because I've been in this as long as I have, Saul Bass, a very famous graphic designer, would say, it's love and money. I do this for the client for money, and I do that for myself out of love. So there's a kind of idealistic and nostalgic, almost romantic idea of the creative doing their important work on the side surreptitiously while the client was paying the bills for getting the other stuff done. But the nature of the practice has really changed as well, and is changing quickly with regard to the impact of AI, artificial intelligence, and what designers do all day and what they will no longer do because we have machines to do that. And the reference for that, I think, goes back a bit in time to Kinsey Wark's book on the Hacker Manifesto. Hacker Manifesto was kind of a reinterpretation of Marxism and looking at what happens when everything goes digital and labor turns into bits and so forth and so on. So it's an early work, and I think I would also recommend his most recent book, the Sensoria, to think of. It's a wonderful set of essays of his on other people's ideas about the 21st century. So thinkers for the 21st century about creative work and this medium that has emerged that we all work within. Very different from anything 20, 30, 50 years ago. So the other thing that goes along with this is the comment, that goes even further back from Michael Lessie, who's a humanities professor out in Smith College, I think. He wrote a book called The Wisconsin Death Trip, which is kind of this non-intuitive view of how people treat each other in the world. And it wasn't, all violence was not in the cities, and it's also in the rural parts of the world. But a comment he made to me, I had lunch with him once, and he said, graphic design is just counterfeiting. And you have to stop if you're a graphic designer and think about that, because that's something you do for a living, and say, no, you're just counterfeiting. You're making something appear to be something that's not. And a lot of that happens in industrial design as well. We can all see it, and in architecture, what have you, making something appear to be something that is actually not. That's a kind of counterfeiting. So think about currency that way, and then you can kind of see that design as a practice over many years now has been either a kind of casino where people speculate on values, future value of things, and they don't know what the value is until it enters the market, because these are novel things that are being brought into the world through designers, specific designers and their clients, or a magic show. In other words, you don't see how it's done, but you see results. And so Buckminster Fuller would say, we don't know what design is. It's like electricity. We can just measure the results. We can't really describe what it is, but you can measure the results. You can see results from it. So if we look at that, at results that way, you can also say designers work with form. It typically was around form and function primarily. Now we move to form and belief, form and behavior. And in a way, as a kind of investment, it's form and fruition. What will come of this? It's a thing, but what does the thing make happen? And that looks full life cycle, feedback loops, going back into what I made, what happens because I made it, and so forth and so on. So that shift as well represents these other points of view. So that work with form is central to the work of designers. But I think in some sense the practice itself, if you look at the recent, from last week even, Design Management Institute Value Awards happened in Boston. If you read through the winners, interesting term, the winners of that competition for the best of class, every project is so diffuse. You don't know who the designer is, where the designer is, who did what. They're all systemic. They're all systems approaches. They're all feedback loops. They're all nonlinear, and they're all about process. They're all about service. They're not really about objects. They're not about things, right? And this is sort of the 30,000 design managers in the corporate world getting together constantly and every year for this kind of like, well, what have we done this year? What is its value? That, of course, is their own critique of their own work, which is something design has always suffered from, not having critique from outside the practice, right? And that's why design research and design theory are important to bring critique into it. So I can't help but say then we need to kind of think of form, all the form that's available to us and our senses. Think of form as social currency. So if you now think of these things as symbols of debt, which is what Peter Fende would say money is a symbol of debt. If you turn that around and think that way about it, you will reveal, kind of expose all the other lies that he talks about in his book. So that being the case, the question around form as social currency means we have to think about this flow of information, how money moves to value. It moves quicker to value that it understands. It moves quickest to value that it understands and trusts. So in some sense, this issue of deception comes up. Virilio's book, Paul Virilio's Strategy of Deception, is like how much deception or mask of the marketplace is at work here, or how much are we deluding ourselves by what we think we're doing, where other things happen, unintended consequences come from the work of designers. So if you want to go further into that, I really recommend Crowds and Power by Elias Canetti. It's how packs and groups and congregations of people effectively and their desires turn into how power is yielded and by that and wielded in the world as well. So with that in mind, it's good to remember also this in the strategies of deception that in game theory, now there's some games people maybe in the room, but game theory, what's the best way to win a game? What's the best strategy for winning a game? To cheat. So if you think about that, then we understand the power of deception at work in the marketplace. And if we look at that at scale, we can see some of the cheating going on, right, through that kind of deception. So what happens to our economy as it moves toward, well, speaking of fascism, it moves toward monopoly, it moves toward disparity, and it moves toward exclusion. What's the opposite of those three? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. You may remember them. They've not quite been erased from in the memory hole. So with that introduction of form as social currency as one thing to think about, I want to turn it to Guy to talk about flow through the system in these coming out of his work with the economies of design and thinking systemically about what moves the system to act in the way that it does. With that, we'll turn the table over to Guy to take us through that.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Nathan. A wonderfully eloquent opening there. And yes, I see someone's put in the chat. Can you provide us with a reading list, please?
Yeah.
There's lots of stuff I need to read there.
Rather than the actual books.
Moving stuff through the system. It reminds me of Gordon Reevely, who's a design historian in the UK, once quipped at a conference, design is like a laxative. It helps move things through the system quicker. Anyway, yeah, okay. Well, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me to this occasion. You wanted about 5 minutes, didn't you, as an introduction? I've just got 2 points to start off with, and then, because I think we need to hear from others and so on. Yeah, I mean, I was really interested to hear you say, yes, money is taboo. And I just think economics has become such an elephant in the room of design schools. Certainly my experience in Europe, particularly in Finland, I know that in America people are perhaps a bit more easy about talking about money. I'm not sure about economics in general, but I'm finding design schools will do everything to avoid talking about money and economics. And it's kind of weird because you get this tumbleweed moment sometimes, when, design as a problem solving activity ostensibly, and increasingly our students want to deal with, questions of social justice, social inclusion, and all these sorts of things, around decolonialism, around multi-species justice, identity politics, and this sort of thing. And you kind of raise something about the kind of economic interests that are maybe behind these injustices, and then you get this sort of tumbleweed moment where just there's this silence, yeah, I mean, I think sociologically this isn't just to do with us doing a bad job in design schools. I think it's something to do with the, let's call it, separation of economic thought from everyday life. I'll come back to that. I mean, but before I get to that, though, it raises the question, well, in design schools, should we be teaching economics? Well, yes and no, I think. I think no, in terms of should we be teaching business skills. And I know I hear a lot of students and others say, yeah, we should have more business skills so that we can enter the market and this sort of thing. I think business skills, firstly, are not difficult. You can learn them on the job to start with anyway. Plus, I think the design industry itself is so diverse. It works in so many speeds and so many different kinds of clients with so many different kinds of media. I don't think, one business skill for, I know, service strategy designer is going to be different from an illustrator or a graphic designer and so on. So, I think that's just something you learn through doing. So there's that at the other end, one end, the kind of nuts and bolts of economic practice, business skills, no, forget it. And then at the other end, should we be teaching, Adam Smith and Maynard Keynes and, big economic theory? I don't think we should do that either, because it just divorces economic thought from what I think is far more important here, is to think about how does economy, or how do economies, I should say in the plural, map onto or create or structure material, visual, digital, spatial cultures. How are these two things entwined? But also importantly, and this is what I was trying to get to with my book, Economies of Design, was how does design shape economic practices as well? And I was really, what was really important to me as well in the book was to talk about economies in the plural. Okay, so, I don't know about in the US these days, but in much of Europe, you switch the television on at news time and they talk about the economy as this sort of singular entity. What they're talking about is a particular notion of what the economy is. And I think it's just as design is very diverse. I think, it's really important to think about economies and how different forms of economy, different scales, different social practices, and that sort of thing. Yeah. So, however, if you were going to ask me, well, what's one thing, and this is my second point then, what one thing should we be thinking about with regards to the relationship of economics and design. And for me, it's the problem of surplus capital. In other words, particularly over the last 40 years in the neoliberal era, with flexible accumulation, the deregulation of financial exchange and the banks and all this sort of thing, money can go pretty much anywhere where you can look for a profit. Okay, and I looked this up. Currently, there's $188 trillion in financial assets at the moment. So that's $188 million. It's a sort of unimaginable amount of money. Okay, so this is held in pension funds, wealth funds, endowment funds, mutual funds, insurance funds, shareholders, and all these sorts of things. Okay, all these funds looking for sources of rent. Okay, sources of interest, money growth, basically. And if any of you familiar with Thomas Piketty's wonderful book Capital in the 21st Century, he basically argues, and he does the number crunching, he does the math, and over history, and he works out that effectively, increasingly since the 1970s, what makes money in the world is money. Much more than services and products and all this experiences and this sort of, it's investments basically. And so we've got this problem though of masses of money looking for sources of investment. I tell my students, look, shopping centers, we as consumers don't need shopping centers. Okay, investors do. If you look at most shopping centers around the world, most of them, behind them is a pension fund, an insurance fund, and this sort of thing. Shopping centres are great ways of, creating a sort of steady return on investment over the life of a shopping centre, 20 to 30 years, and so on. Okay, there's all kinds of other examples one could cite here. That Ford motor cars, maybe since the collapse of General Motors, not so much, but I mean, Ford motor cars makes more money from lending money than from selling cars. Okay, so what does that make a car, right? Or I remember Saskia Sassen makes this wonderful point about buildings. There are ways of, you put up a building and it's a way of releasing capital to go then into global flows. So you build a building, you then I think Trump's done a lot of this. You then raise a lot of money on the value of that building to invest somewhere else, and so on. So, what I think design is doing is driven by, in many, many occasions, is, solving the problem. Okay, you think of design as a problem-solving activity, but it's solving the problem of surplus capital. Okay, and David Harvey, the geographer based in New York, talks about this as the spatial or technological fix of fixing the problem, putting, not physically putting money into a place by, building a Trump hotel or creating some new technology, and so on. Fixing the problem in a space, but also fixing the problem of all this money, what to do with all this money. So this, for me, in design is the big challenge one has to work out, or work out a way out of. Perhaps we'll talk about, questions of degrowth and how you design for degrowth and other sort of challenges later on this afternoon. But yeah, okay. So in short, let's talk about money. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll keep rolling, give everyone a chance to speak first from their point of view, their perspective. And again, that's triangulating a very broad subject and a very sort of puzzling subject. That was the invitation to the first conference was, hi, I'm Nathan. Money is a puzzle. Help me figure it out. So we have many puzzles and enigmas as well involved in the whole discussion. We'll move with Özlem will move to sort of a national scale and talk about design as it relates to sort of the transition or say the symbiotic nature of craft and industry, in particular because her focus is on industrial design. So you can see immediately you think about mass consumption and production of people to consume and how it relates. But then in particular, I would say a kind of fix, maybe Dulmini brought up double binds yesterday, and we can talk more about those as well, but the kind of double bind that design is inside national economies who are struggling to figure out what happened to industrialization, even here, like what is that nostalgic idea of some kind of industrial base here? Does it mean anything in the future? But this idea of craft, making, industrial design, and the role in a national economy linked to other economies, obviously. But yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Guy, for setting this scene, if you like. I value that you mentioned there isn't one economy. In fact, there are economies. I think, for example, we experience all these things, capitalist development in a different way in a country like Turkey, which is a late industrialized or emerging economy. There are different terminologies in describing countries like Turkey. So we, in a country like Turkey, for example, it's a taboo to talk about, especially in design education. It was a kind of taboo to talk about money. And when Nathan, for example, asked me to participate to this panel, it was design and money, and I was thinking, what, you know, I don't know anything about money. I was on a payroll all my life. I didn't start a business. I didn't earn money out of a business. I was an employer of state university first, and then now a private university. So we have this kind of strange relationship with money. We know that our whole life is related with a capitalist economy, but we have a kind of strange relationship with it as well. And we noticed, actually, I noticed this as a problem in design education, and I started design management, talking about design management, for example, to designers, because I saw that they were having a difficult time in seeing their work actually having a value in a company setting, because we were mostly taught about design like a modernization project. It's design was imported. Design education was imported to Turkey as part of the modernization and industrialization process, and we were taught in a kind of way that we have to industrialize like the industrialized nations before us industrialize. We have to develop as well. We have to go through the same stages that they have gone through. So that was the idea. But later, we understood slowly that we need to create our own understanding. We need to create our own models of teaching. We have different issues to tackle with. We have different problems that we need to understand. So that kind of creative engagement with your own education model takes time, because it takes, you need to build self-confidence. This is what we experience somehow, because you import the knowledge, it takes time to build self-confidence, to come up with creative and new thinking. So this was our experience. And when Nathan, talked about this issue, I was thinking, for example, this catching up mentality has also problems with it, because you can't just experience every mistake that the other nations before you have done. So you have to maybe skip some of those, and you have to develop your own answers to some of the issues that we are faced today. For example, climate change. You can't ignore it. because we are faced with the results of all these issues more. For example, Turkey imports waste from UK. A nation is very developed. They produce a lot of waste. What happens to that waste? For another country, that waste is a huge problem. So we can't ignore that we live in the same on the same earth. We face these issues all together, and we need to come up with solutions that would benefit us, but also beneficial for our living on this earth. Another thing that we faced, although we have a very important cultural base and we have crafts, because of this catching up mentality and because of the modernist paradigm, we were ignoring our crafts. For example, we were seeing these kinds of things a bit backwards, and we have to we have to modernize them. We have to get rid of these old type production methods. For example, that was the thinking before, but later we understood that in fact there is value in these kinds of old way of doing things. We can learn from them. We can also transform them into new value. So we also started working with craftspeople, created some models in engaging with them, and again, all these things require a different way of looking at your own reality, not from the lens of the Western perspective. You need to look at your own reality and develop your own perspective, but also knowing that we are not alone. Other countries, for example, there were also very good examples in India that we didn't know. We were looking at Western education models, but we weren't looking at Indian experience, for example. So we became aware that we have to learn from all of these countries, and there is value in all of these experiences. But as I said, these things don't come naturally. You need to develop this kind of thinking and also insert this kind of thinking into your students, and see their own situation with a different eye, and see the value that they can bring to the world from the perspective of their own environment. So this is what I can say at the moment, maybe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we shift again, another point of view, another perspective, and all of them coming from very rich threads, because our good fortune, we have people who are thinking globally and locally at the same time, and in some cases universally, and also with regard to the very particular, which is always important to do, moving from the abstract to the practical or pragmatic aspects of any vocation or practice. So Dulmini moves us to this almost the power of an individual model within a community building value within a totally different kind of value system. I just saw an exhibition this summer at Vitra around Shaker communities who created their own kind of economy. They're iconic in terms of the design form that they've created and its relationship to modernist ideas about design, form, and function. But the way they sort of eschew the way they employ the market rather than capital was really fascinating in the development of their community. And they're a very community-based model, almost like an extended family. Dulmini will also, based on what we've talked about so far, bring up this idea of feedback and second order cybernetics, and the flows then turn into feedbacks in these systems, and keeping track of the variety of feedbacks within this variety of economies, within the variety of practices of design that have emerged over time. So the complexity continues to increase, and cybernetics is a great tool for addressing complexity, to try to tease it out and understand what the facts of life are in that. So thank you, Dulmini.
Thank you so much, Nathan, and thanks to Guy and Özlem for sort of setting the scene. I thought I'd just present a project that I've worked on both as a historian, because I'm really interested in the history of systems practices, but it's also existent at present as a project, and it's a project that we also need to think about in terms of its futures, because it's constantly struggling to get funding and further support. So what I'm going to connect is perhaps a story, a sort of a historical story with a present practice model or a kind of organizational model. So it's the story of this person called Annetta Pedretti. And she was, I mean, I don't think you can consider her a designer, but she was a sort of a creative, not a sort of a mainstream designer. She was a creative practitioner who had many practices which contributed towards a design project. And what's really interesting is it's almost sort of the opposite. So Nathan has proposed this word money, and she really didn't have a lot of money throughout her life. And this project started with, so it was almost this moment in the 1980s. And I think Guy's book describes this beautifully, the sort of the moment of neoliberalism with Thatcher and Britain, and it's located in East End. And so on the one hand, there's all this sort of speculation markets, a rise of sort of high-rise developments and the money flowing there, and the bigger questions of conservation and heritage playing out in East End, which is a very particular neighborhood with a lot of migrant communities and sort of growing the tensions between emerging markets and sort of sustaining the survival of many different forms of life. And in this moment, the government starts to hand over grants for creative practitioners, as they sometimes do, to take up one of these properties and develop it. So she basically, it's not her capital, so she doesn't invest money, she uses that money to get into the house. And the moment she starts to repair the house, she starts to sort of think what that practice could mean. So there's a sort of a speculative practice that starts to take shape. And she starts to see how that can be a form of resistance against sort of mainstream forms of speculative and market practices. And towards till the end of the project, till her death, she didn't have a lot of money. But so what she does is she sort of creates sets of relationships across the site through different projects that help sustain the project. And this is how House of Annetta, so now this is managed by the architecture firm Assemble, together with sort of funding from different organizations, and it's still a running project, and they have to figure out funding all the time, but to sort of use it as a space of resistance against the bigger speculation and sort of markets that's happening. And what's really interesting in Annetta's work is because she's, as Nathan mentioned, a sort of like second order practitioner, which means her focus is, or never was, on thinking about how do we develop this as a design or the form, and how do we just do that. But in every moment she was doing something in terms of the house, whether it was developing the sort of renovating or thinking about shifting the sort of windows, buying the material. In all these practices, she was constantly thinking about the conditions in which she's operating. And she does this by using what some of you might know as sort of reflective practices. So she had this sort of extensive writing practice where she takes notes of all the things that she's doing, her feelings, but at the same time, she uses different methods to always think about the conditions under which her imagination, but also the public imagination, is operating. So this is very interesting.
Yeah, sorry about that.
But anyway, but we have an exponential growth in the number of people engaged in design, but at the same time, we have diffusion of the practice, the increase in complexity and speciality of practice as it becomes applied to more things, because each context is very different in which design principles get applied. So that diffusion of the practice and the kind of confusion about who does what has got to an epic scale. And what's happening with regard to what Guy was talking about, moving capital, is that people figured out how to monetize the activity of designers, not the resultant value, but the activity of designers by consolidating firms. So it started in, I'd say it started in the 1990s, when, for me, the thing I noticed was Clement Mock, who had worked with Steve Jobs at Apple and had his own design consultancy, very avant-garde practice on the West Coast, sold his company to Sapient, a consulting firm. That was a signal moment. At that moment, and that followed many more of these consolidations of design firms of a modest size, again, the large size design firms, standalone design firms being acquired. So they're accumulated into these consolidated practices that become more like a consulting practice, which means you borrow your client's watch to tell them what time it is, and you get paid for that. Right? So it hollows out the practice. Hate to put it so bluntly, but it hollowed out the practice of design to where it's unclear who's actually doing what. And so much of the work now is, although there's still a modest amount of heroic work done by notable designers producing iconic pieces, that a smaller and smaller number of people doing that, and a larger number of people get involved in sort of emulative practice or reconfiguring of components that have already been made. They're reconceiving them in different contexts, different environment. So that hollowing out of the practice is also accompanying this consolidation. And the thing that goes with that is sort of the IP meets IT, meaning the knowledge of how design is practiced is disappearing. It's disappearing because of non-disclosure agreements, work for hire contracts, people, musicians selling their library, Taylor Swift's problem, right? What happened to my original creative work? More importantly, what happened to how this stuff comes to be? So the shift of sort of conformance to the dominant economic model means that's what we see more and more. So design practice itself starts becoming this kind of opaque facade over things just seeming to occur out of nowhere. So we don't understand how things come to be. We don't understand the deep investments that have been made over a long period of time because everything seems to appear immediately and perfect until we go to use it and then it breaks. Right? So it's a very fragile situation. Economically, we're in a very fragile period at every scale with regard to the economy. Even students thinking about vocational interests of, now I've studied design, where do I go practice that design? And Özlem referred to that in her piece about the local, the national economy and design education, and where should our designers go from here? What should we be teaching and what should we be learning and training people in, and where do they go to practice that? So I just throw that in as something to keep track of in terms of value that's generated by designers through their activity, much of which is not really the essential gambling that goes on of bringing a designer in to help people who don't know what to do, because you have the audacity to say what you think they should do and the ingenuity to back up your audacity. The very special practice. It's called gamblers. Right? We don't know, but we're speculating. So it's highly speculative activity at the heart of the matter too. So I'll just throw that into the discussion and can take it from there. Let others talk about that.
Yeah, if I may jump in there, that's really interesting. I don't know how you want to chair this, Nathan. Shall I put my hand up when I want to say something, or
just start speaking? Yeah.
Okay, I'll just say, well, okay. Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting thought, the way in which kind of the labor of design is, I mean, it's been opaque for a very long time, but it has been made more opaque by the multiplication of different ways of doing design and not really understanding. But I think it kind of yeah, and for me that links also to a broader let's call it a problem in creative industries, this thing about, the love or money thing, that I was chairing an event last night, in fact, at Aalto University where I work, where we had a bunch of designers talking about their careers and so on. And I was sort of surprised really how it came back to lots of those kinds of self-identity cliches of being a designer, of getting out there and networking and making friends, and all those soft skills being so important, of course, which they are, but it blurs this distinction between sort of wage labor and experiential labor, as Yanis Varoufakis calls it, this idea of putting your heart and soul into something. But I don't think this is just necessarily specific to design or the creative industries in general. I think there's been this blurring in other places as well, and I think the growth of this kind of techno platforms has effectively drawn in sweat equity, let's call it, non-wage labor into producing value. So in other words, like in the social media platforms, for example, producing data, which then becomes material of value to Facebook or Google, whoever. I think you mentioned Mackenzie Walk. He talks about that quite a bit as well. But it's the sort of terrible kind of double bluff we're caught up in here, really. And I think to mention another book I've been reading recently, Yanis Varoufakis' book on techno-feudalism, where he talks about this thing about the monopolies that the big tech companies are creating for them, whilst also benefiting hugely from financial systems, and they benefited hugely from the printing of money after the 2008 crisis. What did most governments do is print lots of money. Where did that money go? Mostly to tech companies and big investors in tech companies and similar things. And after COVID as well. So that we've kind of got ourselves a bit sort of stuck up an alley in this, really.
Yeah.
And how do you recover this sense of wage labor? And I think Doreen said your talk about the NF project was really interesting in that respect, because it builds up this idea of, well, there's these other symbolic and practical and other economies going on, which I think J.J. Graham Gibson talk about very nicely as well. There's the wage economy, but there's all these other things going on as well, and it's a question of how do you keep these other systems of exchange live and happening and useful, and not get sucked up into this kind of capital wage area. Sometimes it's quite a good thing.
Well, I've sometimes told students there's an infinite amount of work. There's a finite number of jobs. And if you can turn your ideas into work, then that turns into jobs. So there's kind of a reverse way to get into it. But that requires that sort of emotional investment as well. It's like extrinsic values of what you're making, or the speculation that's involved. But in the commercial contractual situation, you have this bet going on. You're betting that this thing might have value. And in that sense, I think even though not learning, I agree with what you said about business practices and how they relate to the practice of design itself. But I think it's really important for designers to work with clients rather than for clients. And this is something that I think that the nature of a cybernetic practice, a second order cybernetics, would be to include your client, who after all is the expert and the decision maker about how the money will be spent ultimately on any given project, and to take on, at least try to take on that point of view of a risk manager. So you can think about that in terms of, is the work I'm doing going to contribute to climate, mitigating climate change problems or not? So you can, on an individual level, look at the work and choices and decisions you're making about that. In some sense, I would say design moves away from the designing of form to asking this question, in game theory, for example, it's like decision theory. What are the decisions being made? Of course, you're making decisions if you design, but there's another set of decisions being made around that, creating the context within which you're working. And the more cognizant you are of that, the more you can participate in that. And the more they can participate in your activity as well. So it becomes a reciprocity, which is was best described to me by the architect Frank Gehry, who encouraged his clients to play with him in his studio, physically play with balling up paper and pretending it's a building, to one, appraise them of how difficult it actually is. So they start to see the value of it. And to also engage their mind in thinking in a speculative way, rather than a contractual way from a design brief, anyway, so.
I would perhaps add to this that with new technologies, with AI, there is this promise maybe that it creates a kind of level playing ground, that if you have all these technologies, you can also jump several steps ahead and you can compete directly with the leaders because you have the same technologies. But I think this inequality in terms of opportunities and techno-feudalism concept, I think that will continue. That's my fear, because although you are seemingly free to use all these technologies, you are not again in the center, and we are users of these technologies, not creators. So I think this inequality issue will continue between the creators of these technologies and users of these technologies. So and also, it's getting, as you said, who is the owner of the idea? Who is the what will be the power of the designer? Like you mentioned, the Design Management Value Awards, there's a strong emphasis on the relation between client and the designer, and the designer becomes anonymous. But in design education, we still seem to value the ownership, the creative input. We value creativity a lot. But who is the owner, and is it actually meaningful to continue design education in this way? I think these are also questions that we need to ask. But in a way, the technology advances so quickly that we can't even grasp of it, and we kind of lag behind. I think that's also a trap and difficulty that I think it exists. Also, designers rely on the technologies that are made available to them. They don't create them. So I think we are in a kind of unknown situation, unknown territory now. Our even education, everything is changing very quickly, and maybe we will get as extinct soon. I don't know. I mean, there is this difficulty that I think we are faced with, and I see that all these issues, now technology creates such a level playing field. We can, if we have access to all these technologies, we can do whatever we want. We see this is happening in service industry in a way, especially in countries like Turkey. In services, in some fields, we see that new ideas emerge. There is a lot of creativity in building new services, but in terms of material products, energy, all these fields is a different area, I think.
No, because I think Özlem was talking about. I think, I mean, one word when it came to like technology and speed and what's happening to, I think, speculation, again, we can go back to the 80s. I mean, this was a moment where this was starting to be theorized. And I just wanted to show this one slide. And this is from Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism. And the sort of moment, is there no alternative? And what he's also starting to map there in some ways is what Özlem was describing in also a different way, technology, speed, and acceleration, right? So processes of acceleration and how the fact that changing so quickly and technology is contributing to that. So how do you intervene in such a system? And I think the most important thing in, when you talk about capitalist realism and what Mark Fisher's in that whole argument is how these speeds also impact our other sort of libidinal processes, so attention, thinking, and how do you sort of work with that? And I think the part of the project is how do you also work with desire and try to create other desires? And what's the speed at which that operates? And I was just thinking that when Özlem was making that comment.
Yeah, thank you very much. And also for bringing up desire, because the other overt title for this session is Design and Desire. We have to really say that. And we have to also say this session is about design and violence. So these are big covert titles for something that goes by, maybe form as social currency. But design and money was sort of the most sort of kind of opaque and broad title we could put on it. And as it says, the word money freaks people out in certain worlds, but it's just commonplace word for something that in itself operates in very sophisticated ways and operates in ways that have huge impact on all these practices because they are focused on generating choice. They're generating choice about which decisions will be made and choices that you have to face in your day-to-day life. How are you spending your time? So I bring that up based on sort of what's behind all this. Or could we talk about disparity being produced by people being greedy? Well, let's just say it. And then we know that there are very sophisticated and very fast systems, technologically based systems, in the movement of capital around the world. It moves in nanoseconds from A to B to C to Z without people kind of knowing that every time it moves, a little bit of money falls off the table. What we see in our daily lives amongst the objects and things and buildings we live in, we see sort of the residual trickle down is actually a trickle. But those trickles come from massive transactions made in secret as very opaque, and each of those loses a little bit of money in the sale. So, Coates, the Nobel Prize winning economist, talked about the cost of that movement. Anytime you move capital, there's a cost to it, and somebody gets something out of that. So it's good to think about the economies on a large scale because what's happening at that scale is affecting us more immediately all the time. It could, if it took 2 weeks to get the news from London to New York, that was a different world. But now it moves to where trading desks are trying to figure out how they can cut nanoseconds out of response times to their screens in terms of what the value of something is. So they're constantly chasing what they perceive to be value. And of course, that is only the value that moves abstractly within the system because they're the ones who know how to convert that kind of currency, right, into wealth. So, but to convert it into a quality of life requires a different view of economic activity. And labor and your own investments that you're making with your time and what you decide to study to go and do those things. So these are big questions in front of all of us.
And thinking about how other people's quality of life are affecting our quality of life. I did a little calculation last night because I was thinking about someone like Jeff Bezos, okay? His wealth currently is around about $235 billion. and I was trying to work out, in terms of passive income, what does that mean? That is, I worked it out as if he's making 5% interest on that money because he's probably got it invested somewhere, and he's paying tax, but I doubt he is paying tax. But let's assume he's paying 40% tax, which is probably what he'd be paying here in Finland. I bet he'd be making $145 million a week. Okay, so what do you do with that money? I mean, it will take quite something to shop, and spend $145 million a week. Yeah, of course. So you reinvest it and you kind of build the financial bubble further. Okay, so that's one thing. We have to keep that in mind because, of course, it is the super rich who are causing massive, climate destruction. Okay, so the top 10% of the wealthiest top 10% since the 1990s are responsible for 2/3 of global warming. Okay, so we have to think about how inequalities are driving climate change, for example, and then we have to think about, well, what do we do about that? We could chop their heads off, have another French Revolution. We could tax them to death. That'd be quite difficult as well. Or we could sort of take a kind of curiosity in their lives and their kind of consumption behaviors, and what is it that makes you want to have so much money, and what you do with it and how you conceptualize it and so on, as this kind of design problem. Okay, that might be one sort of softer way of doing it. I'm not sure if it would ever work, but we have these kinds of problems, that one person's quality of life is not the same as another, but they do impact in different ways on each other, negatively and positively.
Years ago, I had a student in my design systems class pick a project. They each picked a project, and his project was how to be a billionaire. And I thought about it for a moment and said, okay, good project. I wrote him a check for $1 billion. You said how to be a billionaire, not how to make $1 billion. I'm giving you $1 billion. You come back next week and tell me how you spent it. And the rest of the students will judge you based on how you spent your $1 billion. First of all, he couldn't understand. You remember that, Ashley? Anyway, he couldn't figure out how to spend $1 billion. He couldn't figure out what to do with it. He was flummoxed by the whole proposition. But the lesson was learned, and his next project was about producing nonviolence in response to what was happening in his neighborhood. Anyway, so this link between violence and money and extreme wealth is a design. Not a problem, but I would say a situation that needs to be addressed by thinking creatively about ways we can approach the same goals in different ways, which is really a sign of intelligence, to be able to get to the same goal with a different way, a different strategy. And that invokes creativity right at the heart of it, which I think is the essence of what draws people into even wanting to be designers or operate as designers in the world. So I think the example you brought up, the meaning of an individual using their creativity to figure out how to transform each moment, each object, each experience of that place, is exactly the kind of really almost exhausting process of continually asking yourself questions. Rather than figuring out how to find the solution to a problem, but understand how to improve a situation for a different result. And I always think of that in terms of the architect Jan the Builder, who says about his work, he said, we're not finished. Our work is not finished, but it's not unfinished. And I think one of the things, core ideas of his own practice, is that architects shouldn't leave the building. So in other words, this contractual relationship to create something is you're done and then you go away. Teams of people move amongst companies doing design projects and they go on to the next one. But this idea is one of sustained, persistent engagement over long time, which is the case of
That's what I was trying.
what you were talking about, is that engagement and persistence and diligence and vigilance to be aware and operating in a situation you're continually trying to improve means that you don't come to a conclusion. And your work is now not progressive or linear or has conclusions, but it has moments and events that happen in it. And it's more about process than product. The work is never finished, so to speak.
So we open it up.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I like the example that Julier brings up about Jeff Bezos, and I think that's really relevant. I think it's easy to think about that a lot, to get existential about it, and to say we should be putting maybe more money into public services. I think we can all agree that maybe we need to kind of reframe it and to make profitability not, the key driving factor, but how do we convince decision makers that we need designers and we need people to be working on projects over long periods of time so that we're keeping track of what's going on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what's the incentive for people to make that investment? Yeah.
I've got an answer for that. It's a very slow and long-term answer, and I probably won't see this in my lifetime. But Dulmini was talking about speed, and the kind of AI speeding up, the tools speeding up processes. I would say that in that I call artificial intelligence manufactured stupidity, because it's all about the results and not the process. You don't learn anything about the process using AI. Like get an AI to write your essay, your term paper or whatever, you won't learn anything. You probably produce a reasonably mediocre, passable essay. Anyway, aside from that speed, and all that kind of thing, and this notion of a modernity we're living, the kind of great acceleration. At the same time, there's a whole bunch of stuff in the world which is slowing down currently, like population growth, like numbers of patents which are being registered is slowing down. We've kind of run out of innovations, effectively. All the big innovations have been done. It's now just fiddling around at the edges, mostly, I think. What else? Debt accumulation is slowing down as well, apparently. So in the wider sense, and I wonder why this is. I wonder if this is partly related in some way, but I can't work out how, to the kind of turbulence we're living, with Russia, Ukraine, and so on, and Trump and so on. That we're at the beginning of some, a period of huge turbulence because of these, partly I think to do with these two speeds going on. This kind of end of modernity, speeding up, must be faster, must be more efficient, productive, and so on, versus this, some of the big stories actually slowing down, and how do we sort of put those things together is, I think, probably the kind of, the long-term, question in response to your very interesting idea there.
Can I say something here?
Yes.
As far as I see, like, for example, in Turkey, we saw a big increase in the employment of designers in UX businesses, in banks, for example, in e-commerce companies, and they were not employing designers before, and they found out themselves that in order to have a presence on digital platforms and in order to compete, they need to have a presence in all these platforms, and there are people doing that. So they kind of find out themselves if they need design, they employ you. If you try to persuade them, what you need are designers, and that doesn't work that way. In a way, market conditions work out that way. And I saw, for example, I was in this Design Management Institute conference, I saw that US government offices started to employ a lot of designers. Some designers started working for US government offices. And again, this is because without this, they can't function at this day and age. So it happens in a way through the rapid advancement of technologies, I think. But again, whether designers are, how designers respond to all these developments, I don't think, I think that there is a maybe problem there.
Well, I think what's merged surreptitiously without people noticing it is a distinction between a design firm and an advertising agency and a marketing firm and a marketing consultant. And these have those distinctions have blurred, and those practices have been more broadly distributed in sort of the superficial manner. So I think it gets back to thing Dulmini brought up about desire, and maybe there's a discussion about desire here in the manufacturer's desire, because we're talking about people being employed in managing people's attention. Designers have an intrinsic investment in creating difference. All right, they create a difference, and differences get attention. So these distinctions become finer and finer, but by and large, they're looking to command attention. So you invest your time giving attention to things, and they're trying to do that in a way to sustain your attention to them and put it forward in such a way that you would trust it. So in some ways, create a mask over something that makes something you're paying attention to trustworthy, to give them enough time to present a value that you also have to query. Valuable to whom? To what? And rarely translating that into power. Because it's empowering you with it. In fact, there's probably a kind of theft going on of your time and your attention. And for banking, if you make banking easy, simple, and friendly, well, I can take your money too. Right? What are they doing for you? Right? So the user interface is a key to the mask that's being invented to keep your focused attention on their interest, not your interest. Match and fit those two things.
If I may.
Yes.
Just a brief comment.
Yeah.
I think the attribution to ending warfare, consider what you just stated, has a lot to do with confining design and rooting that experience in a more lateral sense, as one mentioned, stigma. You know, you take that conception and idea and really translate that in a design and formal manner, and that could really like express the expression that people would hope at the end of the day to end warfare, or type of deliberate manner that we see these days.
Sort of reverse the effects of propaganda.
Yes.
So another way to put that. You want to address that? We talked a little bit about that yesterday. In our
History has a great sense of formality. I think.
Yeah.
Once you know your background or where you're contributing to, such as the USA, I think that can really set the tone for the future.
So revealing that.
It depends how you look at it.
Whose
How you
interest?
look.
Yeah.
If I may, I think designers get busy in times of financial recession. For example, you look at the period of America in the 1930s, Darwin Teague, Raymond Loewy, all that sort of stuff. And, design quite often transforms itself as an industry during periods of recession as well, because they're inventing new ways of doing design to get more market, basically, as the market's changing. So it makes you think that designers are also very good at survival. And in those cases of you're thinking through those sorts of conflict situations, how do you respond to that, and how do you reposition, or and so on, is kind of interesting. I'm slightly reminded though of I don't know if you know that novel by Lionel Shriver called The Mandibles, It's 2028 to 42 or something. It's about a family living through the collapse of the American economy, where the dollar is no longer the reserve currency, for example. And they have a member of the family who's studying graphic design at Rhode Island. And it turns out the graphic design is the most useless thing you can do in those situations where people are sort of being made homeless, you know, losing all their incomes and all their inheritances, and so on. But on the other hand, this family are quite good at survival, you know, and dodging and weaving in these conditions. You know, personally, I think, you know, we will be looking at big economic collapses in the next few decades. And, you know, we probably need as many designers as we can for that situation, really. You know, so it might not look too rosy at the moment, but your time might come. Not in the best of circumstances, of course.
Yeah, I mean, relying on a kind of improvisational skill
Yes.
or talent for improvisation to deal with the situation you're in with what you have and ask yourself the question, what's the best thing I can do? What's the right thing to do in this situation, rather than conceiving of something that everyone on earth will need. They don't need now and probably don't need in the future. So the shift of focus to the local, the sort of hyper local of yourself and how you operate in the world. Moving away from this idea that you're doing something of benefit to someone else, find out who that someone else is. It's your neighbor, someone living within your own house, and even yourself, things that are tested every day in situations of sort of chaos and collapse and decay. Who does survive? And, you know, that brings up this essay, which I referred to, Canetti's book, Crowds and Power. There's an epilogue in that book, it came out in the early 80s, I think, called The End of the Survivor. And it completely flips that idea of survival. That in fact, the president of the US right now is the ultimate survivor when you think about all of the track record, so to speak. And someone who can annihilate half the planet or all the population of people on the planet with pushing a button is the ultimate survivor. So Canetti says that's the problem that remains. The other problems we can address, but this idea of someone being the survivor creates this disparity of power that's extraordinarily dangerous and that we're toying with all the time. So yeah, that's the warfare that we're thinking about, right? Any other questions about design and money? Or design, or desire and violence, or who's going to pay for lunch?
Yeah, I was ready to say that.
Well, thank you so much to the panel and also everyone for coming. I mean, I found this incredibly refreshing and also depressing. But it's really, I think, great to think about how some of these ideas get into design curriculums at graduate, undergraduate levels. Yeah.
Yeah. Big question.
Pleasure to be with you. Many thanks for inviting me.
And
Thank you very much.
absolutely
Thank you very much for inviting.
Thank you. And we'll do the book signing in person.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay, bye bye.